Smithsonian Learning Lab webinar, Becoming Us, a New History Curriculum from the Smithsonian. My name is Ashley Naranjo, and I'll be your host for the evening. And today I'm excited to say I'm joined by my colleague from the American History Museum, Orlando Serrano, who's an educator there. Excellent, thanks Orlando. Today what we're going to do is we'll have an open conversation. So you're able to ask questions in the chat box on the right-hand side of the screen. As a question comes in, I'll also highlight it on the screen so you know which questions we're answering. So for example, right now it says, looking forward to a great conversation this evening, and you can feel free to introduce yourself here in the chat. So that's a great way to know which questions we're answering along the way. We want to hear from you, so if you've used Smithsonian resources, museum resources to teach immigration, migration history, please feel free to include that in the chat box. If you have questions along the way, feel free to include them in the chat box, and we'll answer the questions throughout the webinar. If you're tweeting about your teaching experiences, you can mention us on Smithsonian Lab or AM History Museum, AM History Museum. They're up there on the screen for you. Often both of these Twitter handles actually share a lot of great educator resources, so be sure to check back often. So to get things started, I just wanted to mention, for those of you that are unfamiliar, the Smithsonian Learning Lab is a new platform that allows teachers and students to discover all of the digitized materials from the Smithsonian. So that's across 19 museums, 9 research centers, and the National Zoo. It spans all sorts of topics from history, art, science, and culture. And it includes all sorts of different media too. Within the Learning Lab, you can also create your own collections, and then you can share them out with others. So here's what you'll find in the Learning Lab. Like I said, resources, so things like digital images, text, video, audio recordings, websites, lesson plans, and instructional strategies. You'll also find collections that have been created. And on each resource, there's a number of different features that you can access within the resource. There's also different features within each collection too, to be able to copy or favorite a collection. And I should mention that collections can actually be embedded into other websites. And so today we're actually going to learn a little bit more about the ways that the National Museum of American History has been using Smithsonian Learning Lab collections to support these new teaching resources around immigration, migration history. With that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Orlando Serrano from the National Museum of American History. And like I said, if you have any questions along the way, please feel free to use the chat box on the right-hand side of the screen.
All right. Well, good evening, everybody. Ashley, thank you for hosting. And everyone who's joined us, thank you for using part of your Tuesday evening to hang out with us. As Ashley mentioned, we're going to talk a little bit about Becoming Us, a new set of resources that has been put together by the National Museum of American History. Before we begin, let me say a little bit about myself and the work that I do. So I'm the manager for youth and teacher programs at NMAH, and prior to joining the team there, I was a 9th grade English teacher here in Washington, D.C. And it took a lot to get me out of the classroom. And part of the reason I decided to make the transition is to be able to, use some of the collections, the resources that we have at Smithsonian to develop, new materials for you as educators to use in your classrooms. And this has been a project that has been built over the last 5 years. And it is born out of and grows out of the Many Voices, One Nation exhibit that opened 2 years ago. But the research for these particular resources started 3 years before that. As the exhibit was in development, this website, these 5 different themes that we'll get into were in development as well. And Many Voices, One Nation, the exhibit is anchored around around 4 themes. They are that, thinking about immigration and migration as some of it was voluntary, some of it was forced. Some folks were incorporated into the United States as the nation grew, and some folks were already here. And we took those 4 ideas and we sought to expand upon them. And really sort of taking our cue from James Baldwin, one of the quotes that really sort of guides the way we think about education on our team is this right here, that American history is longer, larger, more various, more beautiful, more terrible than anyone has ever said about it. And so we take that to heart and set about creating resources that are more inclusive, more accurate around immigration and migration. Again, as I mentioned, the main inspiration was Many Voices in One Nation that opened 2 years ago. If you get a chance to come to DC, please go see the exhibit. We do have a digital exhibit of Many Voices in One Nation on the American History website. Some of the resources in the teacher materials draw on the exhibit website itself. So I can point out where in fact that occurs. So, you know, those of you who are interested in looking at the digital exhibit are able to do so.
Excellent. And Orlando, I'll share that link in the chat box too. So if people want to take a peek at the online exhibition, they can do so in the chat box. I also wanted to remind folks, as you're coming into the webinar, welcome. We're excited to have you. If you have questions along the way, please feel free to use the chat box on the right-hand side of the screen. Orlando is just started, so you haven't missed anything just yet, but just wanted to remind folks that the chat box is available for any questions. Thanks.
So then, you know, in terms of the exhibit itself, it really takes U.S. history from the very beginning and talks about, you know, unsettling the continent. You know, really that when the United States started to be formed, that there was a lot of history already here. And so the continent was unsettled, and it goes chronologically up to our current moment and hits on different themes. Again, to reiterate them, because we do think they're important, is that some of us came here to the United States voluntarily. Some of us, you know, were brought here against our will. Some of us were already here. Some of us were merely caught up as the, you know, state was expanding westward across the continent. Ashley, can you move to the next slide? Thank you. So these are just some images from the exhibit itself. I do want to point out the photo on the right. One of the questions that I often get asked is, you know, if you could meet anybody in history, who would it be? Easy answer is Dolores Huerta every time, and I got to meet her last spring, so that was very exciting. The other question that I get asked often is, you know, what are your favorite objects in the museum? And both of them happen to be in this exhibit. And one of them is that Statue of Liberty right there in the picture on the right.
Could you tell us a little bit more about this Statue of Liberty? To me, you know, just seeing it compared to the visitors that are in the museum, it looks quite big. And I can't tell exactly from the photo what it's made of, but it looks like maybe paper mache. Is that right?
That is correct. So a little bit about this object. That is the Tomato Statue of Liberty, and it was created by an artist, Kat Rodriguez. And the occasion for its production is a continuing struggle in Florida. So one of the reasons that I really appreciate this object is that I'm a geographer, a labor historian, and the Coalition of Immokalee Workers in Florida went on strike and continues to advocate for fair and living wages for the work that they do. And in the early 2000s, they called for, you know, a boycott of Trader Joe's, Publix, the major distributors of the tomatoes that they picked in the Florida region, and they went, as part of their demonstration and strike, they went towards the Capitol and they carried this Statue of Liberty on the back of their truck as a symbol. And so you can see that Lady Liberty there is holding a bucket of tomatoes as, again, a symbol of, we also would like a chance to engage and participate in the liberty and the freedoms that this nation, was founded on, and that we've heard so much about. So that's one of the reasons I really like that image.
I love that too. And, a simple object like that tells a story from kind of a seemingly, obvious American symbol like the Statue of Liberty, but really tells a story about workers' rights. It tells a story about the artist herself, the community she was supporting. I think there's a lot of layers, so to speak, with that object. So really interesting object. Thanks for sharing, Orlando.
Yeah, and then I do want to point out one more, and it's also on the right-hand side, just because it's easier to see. There's the hood of a car is right above the woman wearing a white dress. And the reason I want to point that out is that is the hood of a lowrider from Los Angeles. And part of what we wanted to do when creating these resources is bring new stories to the forefront, take a twist or present a different perspective of a story that we already know. And we know car culture is important in the United States and in California in particular, in terms of how that state grew and how it was connected to the rest of the United States. But lowrider culture is a distinctly immigrant narrative and take on car culture. And so when we set out to make these, different resources, we wanted to do that. We wanted to create, narratives, bring narratives to the forefront that have not been previously mentioned. And if you look at the landing page for the website, right under the 5 themes that we'll get into a little bit later on, we say that, these are educational resources that are more accurate, inclusive immigration and migration narrative. Ashley, we go to the next slide.
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah, and we wanted to build off of the work that Many Voices, One Nation did to bring these new narratives to light, to include these new stories, or to tell familiar stories from new perspectives. And so we need to figure out how to do that. So we set about doing research. We did know that, like Many Voices, One Nation, we wanted the resources to include all Americans, right? And so on the next slide, you'll see pictures of different, communities, different perspectives, that we wanted to bring to the forefront. We've got young people, we've got, Asian American communities being represented, because we wanted, again, to build on the work that Many Voices, One Nation did in setting out a more inclusive rendering of U.S. history. And in doing this, we did some quantitative research, right? So one of the first things that we did is, contact and work with our affiliates across the country to see if they would be able to support and help us do some of this research. And they were great colleagues and coworkers, and they helped us in this review of social studies state standards relating to immigration and migration. And the quantitative study that we did there was really to figure out, when we look at the curriculum across all 50 states, what topics, what themes related to immigration or migration come up or get taught, and at what frequency does that occur? And sort of not surprisingly, leading the pack was the idea of westward expansion, taught in over 40 states, and those are sort of difficult to read, but I'll let you know sort of the peaks and the valleys there, right? So we've got the age of exploration, we've got colonial immigration, the impact on Native Americans, westward expansion right there in the middle, and then early 20th century European migration, again, stories that we hear often, Ellis Island in particular, and then post 1985 immigration and migration, so more contemporary topics. But some of the other issues that are mentioned to a lesser degree are slavery as forced migration, that that's not imagined or thought of in that way very often.
Mm-hmm.
We don't often pay attention to the migration that came in on the West Coast, thinking about Angel Island in particular in San Francisco and the role of Chinese and other Asian immigrant workers. We often don't also think about migration during the Great War. So the great amount of movement that happened internally between World War I and World War II, and related to that, Great Migration, right? So the movement of Black communities from the South across to the West, up to the North, and into the Midwest as well. And then there were, different perspectives on migration, immigration that were not present, and we'll get into those a little bit later on. So, we saw that definitely there was a need, given the collections that we have, some of the scholarly work that has been done at an academic level and institutional level here within the Smithsonian. And when I say Smithsonian, I mean like NMAI as well, and
the National Museum of the American Indian, for sure.
So we had some quantitative data, but then we also wanted to collect some qualitative data.
Yeah. I'm curious too, if folks that are kind of listening in, if this kind of matches up with what you're currently teaching, the curriculum that you're building in your own districts too, to just understand, is this a surprise to you, or are there other areas where you find that migration is often taught in your social studies courses? Feel free to kind of chime in the chat too. For me, it was really eye-opening to see that really kind of the majority of migration topics are happening at the westward expansion, and then everything else is kind of major valleys, so to speak, of content that's covered. So again, if folks have any thoughts, if they're surprised by this, or if they're hopefully working to change this within their curriculum, let us know in the chat.
All right. And so in addition to the quantitative data, we worked with, we did some piloting, both in our museum and some local schools and districts here around Washington, D.C. We gathered people at different locations that were more informal, not classroom settings. We worked with experts. So for example, Kathy Swan was also someone who gave oversight to the work that we did here. We had experts from across the Smithsonian, like so the National Museum of the American Indian, the Center for Folk Life folks in Smithsonian, National Museum of African American History. We brought lots of minds to bear on what we were doing. And then we asked teachers, if you did, if we offered these kinds of materials, would you use them? We asked teachers to implement small parts of the resources over time, and they corroborated the quantitative data. So we came up with the website. Now, before going to the website itself, I'd like to talk about, the other part that teachers asked for were primary sources. Like, we need help with primary sources. We've got these big textbooks that get at these ideas on some level, but we don't have primary sources. And that's really where we could bring our collections and contribute to creating educational resources. So here is the way that the resources are structured. We, building off, again, those 4 themes from Many Voices, One Nation, we came up with 5 big buckets in that, they all fall into. We talked about borderlands, and really we do think about this with regards to territory and the northern and southern borders next to Canada and Mexico, but also like internally, how have borders been created at the city level, at the community level, and how many times do students, even within the metropolitan DC area, cross one border or multiple borders traveling from home to school? Understanding and recognizing that there are lots of borders of it, that we can think about. Belonging, one of the really big questions that we had here is like, who gets to belong? And how does that change during times of duress? And we'll see that a little bit more. That's a theme that we will really focus on. Then we thought about education and what are ways in which migration and immigration have, function at the educational level, and then policy. How has policy been impacted over time? And then what are ways in which folks resisted some of these changes? Again, whether they were, when they were forced to move, when they were incorporated against their will, when they were moved involuntarily. So those are the 5 big themes that we settled on. And then, so within each of those themes, we have 3 different case studies. So overarching, we've got...
We'll switch over to the case studies. I did want to mention real quick, Orlando, we've had a few comments that have been coming in the chat, so I just want to share them with everyone. We have a comment, hello, I'm a writer, educator, speaker, shaping narratives about immigrants. My TEDx talk on how immigrants shaped the United States is being used in classrooms from elementary to college. And then it goes on to say, I'm excited to learn what's being done in classrooms and in communities. So thanks for that comment. We're really glad to have you with us and glad to hear that you're also creating resources too. I think one of the powerful things about this framework is not only can you use it in the way that it's prescribed, but there's also some flexibility in adding additional resources too. So for example, your TEDx talk might be a perfect example of something that could beautifully complement some of these resources. So thanks for sharing that. I also wanted to mention, as we were looking at that graph of all of the different topics, Robert says, so fewer than 20 states teach about slavery as forced migration. Wow. And so, yeah, I think this series of teaching resources aims to kind of offer a remedy to some of that, to create primary sources, object analysis, and civic skills specifically that can go around these thematic units. So thanks for that. And Robert also says, great themes, thanks. So glad to have you all kind of participating in the chat. Again, if there's things that kind of surprise you, excite you about these resources, just let us know. And Orlando's going to give us a little bit more information about the structure of how these units are created and what their focus is.
Yeah, so you see there sort of the taxonomy of how the website works and the resources are organized. We've got a theme that cuts across multiple case studies. Really the intention here being for teachers to be able to use as many case studies as they want, right? Each case study ranges from 1 to 2 day lessons. So if you have time to do more than one, that's great. If you only have time to do one, that's also great. And in each of the case studies, we have primary sources. Students will practice object analysis and inquiry, and they're also built into the pedagogical practices are ways for students to practice civic skills, such as discussion, deliberation, looking at root causes for contemporary issues. So, the C3 and the NCSS standards are really embedded in the thought processes in terms of how we develop them. So to give you all a better understanding of what this means or what this would look like, in the theme of belonging, we have a hidden history, which is also a feature that we have, put as a through line across all the different themes. Each of the themes have a case study that focuses on a story that oftentimes is left out. In this case, Mexican-American repatriation in the 1930s. So, lots of pushes towards, anti-immigration from Mexico is not a contemporary issue. It actually has roots in the 1930s, and we wanted to make folks aware of that. Racism and removal, we also have a case study that focuses on a topic or a theme or a time that oftentimes gets taught. So Japanese American incarceration during World War II is the known story. And then we also have then a contemporary issue that illustrates the through line of history that we're talking about. And in this case, we have targeted at home Islamophobia in post 9/11 United States. So again, in this particular theme of belonging, we wanted to think about, in times of crisis, how our lines moved around the community that we call the United States. Who gets to belong? And again, especially during times of crisis, how does that really constrict or expand? And in addition to the, themes, individual case studies, we are also building in some educator supports. And there are 4 main buckets that these fall into. So one is a glossary, and we will go over the glossary because, quite frankly, that's one of the most useful tools, regardless of how many, if any, of the case studies you decide to use. That is a style guide that the National Museum of American History is moving towards in terms of how to discuss, and use particular terminology that is very important to be more inclusive. We also focus some key dates and milestones in immigration and migration history. We are developing right now some teacher tip videos. So ways for teachers to create the environment in their classroom to have challenging or critical conversations. Yes, while they're using these materials, because we do touch on critical issues, but other times as well. How can teachers really foster a more inclusive and accessible classroom dynamic? And then we have an essential understandings guide, which is built off of 2 different projects. One, the NCSS 10 themes for historical study, but then more specifically, we do want to recognize that the National Museum of American Indian has put together an incredible set of resources called Native Knowledge 360 that also does a lot of the work that we do from a Native American perspective. So what does U.S. history look like from a Native American perspective? They put together resources for that. We build off of that and said, all right, now what would U.S. history look like if we looked at it through the lens of migration? So we are building off of the work that they have done, and we're very grateful for it. With that, I'd like to show you around the website a little bit.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Orlando. And I think too, one of the things that you mentioned was this glossary. And even as I noticed some of the titles of some of the units, it seemed like those words are specifically chosen too. So could you talk a little bit about, perhaps when I was in school, I learned about it as Japanese American internment, but I noticed the very deliberate use of the word incarceration. Could you talk a little bit about those word choices?
Sure. So that in particular, it's drawing on the work of 2 different intellectual traditions. One, the Asian American scholars who are reframing the fact that folks were removed and set aside from mainstream U.S. society, and folks who work within the field of carceral studies, or prison studies, and really reframing and saying, no, these were not folks who were just moved and put here for a certain reason. They were held captive in a very specific geographical boundary with time constraints, with learning constraints. And so we are following the lead of scholars in these areas. And when righting a wrong, the exhibit that, a lot of the work on that particular lesson plan builds off of, when Righting a Wrong opened in National Museum of American History, we made that shift institutionally to recognize, the work that Asian American activists and scholars and prison studies scholars were doing to get us to think about that period in U.S. history very differently. So yeah. All right.
Excellent. Thanks for that. So here we are on the Becoming Us website. I'll also include a link to this in the chat. If you've noticed in the chat, I've also been linking to other things that Orlando has mentioned. So for example, the Native Knowledge 360 resources from our colleagues at the National Museum of the American Indian. And throughout this entire session, I've done that in the chat box. I should also mention that this webinar will be archived. So if you want to refer back to it, share it with colleagues, fast forward us or rewind us when we get talking too slow, or something that's especially interesting, you can do that as well. So just wanted to mention that as we continue on to now kind of dig into the meat of the actual website itself.
Okay, so this is our landing page, and there are lots of reasons why we chose this as the image. We really appreciate the work that this contemporary artist, Rosalia Torres, did. And this was actually up at Smithsonian and Akasha Community Museum when they did had an exhibit on sort of Afro-Latin connections in communities here in the DC area. And one of the case studies is on DACA, and this artist is paying homage to the struggle of DACA students that they are participating in, the Dreamers, as we now know them. And if you see the butterfly up in the right-hand corner of the drawing, I'm sorry, the painting, the mural, the butterfly has become a symbol both of DACA activists, but also as a symbol of migration. Many artists are using that symbol, so it really kind of caught a lot of the themes all at once. A brief way to navigate this homepage. So up at the top, we've got some resources. As Ashley mentioned, we're going to highlight a couple of those. Under the units and case studies, I didn't put a slide together with all of the different case studies, but we could pause here for a moment and for folks to see the different kinds of stories that we are focusing on under each of the different themes. And so, we run the gamut in terms of history from the late 1700s to our current historical moment, and across lots of areas in the United States and lots of different themes. On the About page, we talk really about how the project came to be, who was involved. But then as you scroll down, I do want to point out a couple of different features here. Here you see a sort of general overview, again, of how did we become us? And that is the question that is at the opening of Many Voices, One Nation. And again, the four themes that structured that exhibit and structure our thinking about how we put together these resources. There's a search box. If you have a topic related to migration or immigration that you'd like to ask, and then right down there is the link to the Many Voices, One Nation website, deliberation guides, which we can talk about if we have time, and then some of the other resources. Okay, so let's go over to a couple of the case studies under belonging. And we'll look at Mexican repatriation. So when you land on a case study, there will be a brief overview of, generally what this case study focuses on. You'll see that you can save this to Pinterest, you can email it. We are working on creating PDF versions of the lesson plan and materials and student-facing documents that you can download. If you don't want to work digitally, if you prefer to work with a hard copy, that will be available. A PDF button will be there by January. That is the goal, so that you can download that as well. You can see that we've got a duration, how long this approximately should take, the historical era. Anytime you see the little plus on our website, that indicates that it's an accordion box that you can open up, and it will let you know, in this case, what the academic standards are that are addressed in this lesson. Below that, you will see some of the key terms and concepts that are important. What are the guiding questions, the essential questions that we had in mind when we framed the particular lessons and objective that the instruction is targeted towards. And again, here, we've got an idea of what a warm-up could be to talk about, to get students thinking activated. We've got a close reading exercise. Sometimes it's a close reading, sometimes it's a mini lesson. And right there where you see ooh, Ashley, can we do something? Can you?
Sure.
Can you click on Cornell Notes worksheet?
Sure. Oh, excellent.
That's exciting. So, because when we were at NCSS, I said that we are working on getting the student-facing documents ready because they were not ready. Now they are, it looks like. So,
hot off the press.
yeah, because again,
Just last week we were at the National Council for the Social Studies Conference. And so I should mention too that Orlando and the team from the National Museum of American History just launched this series of lessons just, I think, last week or maybe 2 weeks ago at this point. So these are all new resources. Orlando, if folks try these out in their classroom, are there ways that you might be interested in learning about what they've, come up with?
Absolutely. So 2 things. I will give you both the general email that you can contact us at, and then my email because I'd like to know.
Yeah, great.
And so Ashley we'll put that in the comments if you like what my email is, and then historyteachers@si.edu.
Perfect. Excellent. So you heard him. He wants to hear feedback about it. So if you do try any of these resources out within your classroom, please do let us know. I think that's really important too. I think the museum is really trying hard to make sure that there's kind of a bridge between the resources that are available at the museum, but also to make sure that these are in classrooms across the country as well. So if something worked especially well, any successes, or even some challenges, I know that they would love to hear from you. It's kind of an evolving project over time too. So teacher feedback is crucial.
And if you happen to be a teacher who tweets about what's going on in the classroom, just mention us at mhistory, what Ashley mentioned at the very beginning. But yeah, so as you can see, we wanted to make this as ready to use as possible. So we included any student-facing documents for the Socratic seminar, ideas of how you might want to structure that, and an exit ticket, what that could look like. So we've got the worksheet there for the Socratic seminar. That's exciting. I'm sorry, I'm just really happy about that because that must have just happened today.
Oh, great. Wonderful. Well, I'm glad to hear that that happened right before the webinar too, so that it's part of the archive as well. I wanted to mention too, earlier in the webinar, we mentioned that Smithsonian Learning Lab collections can actually be embedded into other websites, and you'll see within each of the different units, there are Smithsonian Learning Lab collections of those primary sources and secondary sources that will help you as you're teaching the lesson. So they're all embedded within this website. And the website embed basically allows you to click on each resource so you can learn more about it. There's always a description. You can download it. You can navigate through the different slideshows if you'd like. And then you can also click on the Smithsonian Learning Lab logo, and that'll take you to the full collection if you'd like. But it's a great way to have all of the digital resources that you might need for this lesson in one place. And so you'll see that throughout all of the different units too. So I just wanted to mention that as well.
Yes, thank you. It's the Learning Lab platform has been very helpful for us to be able to gather all the materials together in one place. So, educators don't need to leave, that you all don't need to leave this website to go find these, materials. And, as Ash said, you can download all of them if you, are not working at a one-to-one school, you need hard copies, they're all available there. So that is the general structure of, what each case study will look like. I do want to go over a couple of the key resources. And we can start with the essential understandings so that you all can sort of see what that looks like and what it means. And again, as I mentioned earlier, this is building off of the work of NCSS and the National Museum of the American Indian. We also thought about how, if we thought about these 10 themes from the perspective of migration and immigration, what they would look like. So when you click on the cultures, for example, you'll see that, we take some of the language that NCSS uses at the introduction of these themes, but then with the concepts, we're like, well, how is this different when we look at it from the perspective of someone who is moving or who has moved all the time? So there is no single American culture, language, or narrative. American cultures have always been dynamic and changing. Family relationships, community connections, and geographical factors have always been and continue to be essential in shaping the cultures of individuals living in the U.S. So each of these, has this sort of reimagining of these themes that could be used, even in thinking about your own lesson plans when you're not using some of these materials. How can we get at the idea of time continuity and change or any of the other major themes if we tilt the lens from which we're looking and put migration at the center of it? So
excellent. Thanks for that, Orlando. I really appreciate this. And I also love that there's kind of the teaching connections of which specific units go with which specific essential understanding. So I think that's super helpful to kind of see the way that it's all laid out on the website for you, so it's easy to use. Robert had a question, so I wanted to just go back quickly so that he could see. He asked about the Mexican repatriation specific unit, and he was especially interested just to kind of take a peek at the exit ticket. So I just wanted to kind of show that here for Robert. So here, each of the different areas where it has kind of a plus sign, that allows you to expand so you can see more about each one. And I'll make sure to include the URL in the chat too, so you have it and you can follow along as well. But it's americanhistory.si.edu/becoming-us. And that's also in the YouTube description of this webinar as well. So if you want to follow along, if you happen to have two screens, I know that's not everybody's situation when they're at their home computer or even on the iPad, that sort of thing, but something that you can pull up certainly later so you can kind of explore and dig into some of these things too. Orlando, could you repeat the main email address for the National Museum of American History for Education?
It is historyteachers@si.edu.
Perfect. So I'm also going to add that to the chat as well. And Orlando said I could, so I'm going to add his personal work email as well. So if you do have questions beyond today, if you're kind of diving into some of the materials and you want to offer feedback or guidance to the National Museum of American History, I know they are thrilled to just have as much teacher feedback and student feedback as possible too. So if something worked especially well, that's the way to do it.
Yeah, and so to get at the question that Robert is asking about the exit tickets, some of the exit tickets have student-facing documents already created. Some of them don't, and that one we quite frankly weren't sure if we needed to do a student-facing document for that exit ticket, because I know that some teachers will say, you grab a sheet of paper from your binder, do this really quick, but if you Ashley, if you go under the resegregation of America's schools, that one does have an exit ticket, that if you wanted to have the student-facing document, that gets at this question, that one's ready to go. So we're kind of trying to see which one does it matter. Is that something that teachers do want as well, ready-made? So again, that's the kind of feedback that we want. We do want to know what works. We also really want to know what can be improved, because you all know the teaching cycle is teach, assess, and then reteach. So we need to know, what is out there. Let's evaluate it, and now how can we fix it and make it better? So please, please, please let us know.
Excellent. Orlando, too, I just wanted to mention we just had a few more comments, too. So we have a comment: as a volunteer at NAMAC, the National Museum of African American History and Culture, I look forward to sharing the information with our volunteers. Susan says, I'm also in an ES Media Center, elementary school media center, and we like to integrate curriculum subjects. So the new website definitely has information that she can use for 4th and 5th grade. Many thanks. And so I think what's nice about Susan's comment too is the reminder that it can be cross-disciplinary. I love that, ELA standards are also included in a lot of this content. And it can also be kind of scaffolded and differentiated based on the grade levels that you're teaching too. So all of this content could be adapted. It's clearly, created specifically for kind of, what is it, 8th through 12th grade in mind? But I think, with all of this great content and the legwork that the American History Museum has done, the ability to kind of think of what's crucial for your students and how you might be able to incorporate it in your own lessons, I think is also a possibility as well. So thanks, Susan.
Yeah. So, and then let's go over another resource that I think is, again, very important is the glossary. So when you go onto the glossary, you can download it. And again, this is just very, very important and timely. There are lots of key terms and concepts that, some teachers maybe don't know how to address or how to talk about, or quite frankly, what the language is. And, I work with predominantly Latino students. I taught in Columbia Heights here in DC. And the example that I always draw on when talking about the glossary is that, eventually a student would ask me, Mister, why do you say you're Latino? Why don't you say you're Spanish? And I say, well, first of all, I'm not from Spain. So that's why I'm not Spanish, And then they say, well, why do you say Latino instead of Hispanic? And then, now if you're asked this question, you can check on the glossary and see what the difference is, why I am particular about using the word Latino instead of Hispanic, and why I don't use Latinx, for example, because there are folks who feel a certain kind of way about that. But we've got lots of important topics and concepts like that we really wanted to get out there. And like I said earlier, this is really built off of the work that we're doing within our own institution to make sure we're using inclusive language. We're using sort of like, for lack of a better term, decolonial language to address topics and themes as they should be addressed with the regard that they require and ask for. So again, I always highlight the glossary because this could be like a quick dictionary that you have on your desk, when you're talking about different topics. If you're a history teacher, a language, an ELA teacher, an art teacher, science teacher, it really cuts across all disciplines. It's just something handy, for folks to think about and know about, regardless of content. I guess we can go over the deliberation guide as well. So this is built in and put together in partnership with the Kettering Foundation. And what deliberation guides are set to do is to present students with a situation, right? In this case, we're talking about the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and this is tied to the case study of the Mexican-American War. And so the question here is, what do you do when the border crosses you? And there's an educator guide and a student deliberation guide. The educator guide walks teachers through how to set this up. And for students, it's again the student-facing materials. And to try and explain what a deliberation guide is as simply as possible is, again, students are presented with a situation. So you see here, like, boom, we happen to be in Los Angeles. This is a time frame. This is what's going on, right? And we're careful to say, put yourself in the shoes. No, we're not role playing. We're thinking, like, if this sort of situation arises, what are the possibilities? What are the possible courses of action that were available at that time? What were the considerations? So when you scroll down, you'll see that these are, some more background information, what is happening at the time, like why this is a great time of change. And then you're presented with some choices. We can embrace new opportunities as this is, change is sort of rattling towards us. We can passively resist and refuse to assimilate, or we can actively resist and fight if necessary. These are the options that we have available to us. And then there, the way this is run in a classroom, students go, all right, knowing that, which of those three options is the most appealing to you? What do you think? And then students get into those small groups and they all read, option one, this is what comes with that option. Option two, this is what comes with that option. And then students are brought back together, whole group, and discuss, all right, what are we going to do? These are the options that we have. What should we do? Why should we do these things? And students are encouraged to come to a consensus on, as a class, what we're going to do given the situation and the limits to our actions. And that is put together in the teacher guide, how to guide that conversation as it unfolds when you bring the class back together. We are actually in the middle of developing two more that are hopefully, it looks like, are going to have a publication date of March. One of them will be around the Pueblo Revolt. So that comes under resistance. And then the other one is the Hart-Celler Act. So that comes under policy. So we will have a deliberation guide like this for each of the case studies as well. That can be used as an extension of that particular case study, or as a way to practice, a Socratic seminar, or can be used by themselves if you happen to be talking about immigration in the 1960s, or if you happen to be talking about Western expansion, as apparently 47 states are, right? You can use that deliberation guide on its own if that's all you have time for. So those are some of the resources that we have available right now. Like I said, we're working on a couple of videos on around teacher tips on how to facilitate discussions around critical conversations. To be quite frank, I'm supposed to give feedback on one of those videos today, and it didn't happen. I had a lot of meetings. So, but we are working on those. And then in terms of what else we would like feedback on, we have received immediate feedback from some of our teachers across the United States, and definitely in Puerto Rico, that having this translated into Spanish would be a very important thing to do. So we are working on securing the funding to be able to do that. But we're taking that feedback to heart and we're acting on it. We would also like ideas and feedback on big themes that we could build on. And keep on adding to this. And one of the ones that we're toying with right now is thinking about labor, because that will allow us to get at some other stories of immigration, in the Midwest, in the Southwest, in the Southeast. So we do want to build on this. We are going to take a pause to fix all the bugs on the website that we have right now, to incorporate some of the feedback on materials that can be adjusted, but we are looking towards a new theme that we can add on.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Orlando. I wanted to mention too, you've got a little bit of feedback in the chat as well. So you already have folks that are willing to forward these resources on, share them in conferences, present to other teachers and librarians, and even in community workshops and presentations. So that's very exciting. And then I also wanted to share that the deliberation guides, Joan mentions that's just a really interesting way to present ideas and kind of decision trees and thinking about consensus too. So lots of good feedback there right away from some of the things that you've shared thus far. I wanted to open it up to questions. We have just about 5 more minutes left in the webinar. So if you have a question that you haven't asked just yet, please feel free to include it in the chat. As you're watching the webinar archive, for example, you'll see that Orlando has kind of shared the American History Museum's process for how they developed these resources. It's in conjunction with the Many Voices, One Nation exhibition at the American History Museum, but this is bringing that content into classrooms across the country too, and providing it in a digital format that can be used and shared across the country. All of these resources are free. So that's also, the price is right when the resources are free. And I think too, some of the things that we've talked about are also ways that they can be adapted, that you could add your own additional resources to the existing framework, or you could scaffold them depending on who your learners are, to think about other supports that might be needed to address these types of topics. I love too that Orlando mentioned kind of the modularity of these resources. For me, I thought it was great to see that you could really choose to kind of do all the units in the case studies, or maybe just choose one that you really hone in on this school year. And then as you get more familiar over time, you could add on to it. The glossary itself, I think, is just a gem. I mean, it's like, I plan to print it out and have it as a reference at my desk as well. I mean, I think, it's 36 pages, but it's a ton of content that you can then make sure that the language that you're using, the words that you're using, are what you really mean and intend to say as you're using them. So I think that's also just a great resource that we've heard about as well. So if you have a question, feel free to include it in the chat. Like Orlando mentioned, he's open to feedback too. So as you're starting to use this in the classroom, please let him know if there are things that you'd like to see in the future. You're getting kind of a sneak peek behind the scenes. So this is actually really just a resource that has come out, a resource series that has come out over the last 2 weeks. So, if you're using it in your spring semester, this is a great time to share that feedback with the American History Museum, and think about the ways that you could either complement or supplement or even revamp your entire curriculum around immigration, migration history. Orlando, are there any kind of closing thoughts that you have that you'd like to share with folks?
Yeah, so as you were talking earlier about the learning labs, I encourage, if you become a learning lab user, you can copy our collection. And as Ashley's saying, if you need to, or if you're scaffolding it in any way, adding more resources, taking away, adding some graphic organizers, because you can, in fact, add graphic organizers or quizzes or sorting activities. We'd like to see how you are augmenting them. Again, that's feedback for us that'll let us know, oh, this is another way in which we can better utilize Learning Lab and, some of the other kinds of resources that teachers are asking for.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so I know many of our viewers are Learning Lab registered users, but if you're not familiar with the Learning Lab, it's a tool that allows you to not only access these digital collections, but it also allows you to make a copy of the collections. So you'll see on the screen, I've kind of hovered over the copy button right there, and that basically allows you to make a copy and make some tweaks, as we talked about earlier. We have just about 2 minutes, so I want to get to these last 2 questions, one of which is a suggestion, it looks like. How about making a video demonstrating a teacher using the site? So that's a great suggestion, or even a quick tutorial on maybe how to get started on the Becoming.
We are doing that, Robert.
Oh, good, good.
Thank you. That's actually another one of my responsibilities. I was a video producer a couple of weeks ago that will, in January, we're looking to launch a couple of teacher tip videos in terms of how to have conversations in the classroom. And in March, yes, a sort of screenshot, this is how to get to here. This is how to navigate the website. This is how to get a hold of us. So thank you, Robert. We are working on that.
Excellent, excellent. And then the last question for the evening, Joan asks, are there regional differences between specific terms? And I think she's referring to the glossary too. So any thoughts on that, Orlando?
There are, and some of those are mentioned in the glossary themselves and in the definition. So for example, Hispanic and Latino do have very regional components to them, where one is more popular in one part of the United States, one is more popular in the other part of the United States. Etymologically, they're very different in that, Latino has to do with all of the Americas, including non-Spanish speaking parts like Brazil and the Lower Antilles. But, there's also definitely a regional dynamic to them, and that's addressed in the glossary, yes.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Robert, Joan, all of the other folks that have joined us for this webinar. Thank you to Orlando, too, and his team at the American History Museum for sharing their resources. Thank you for joining us. We're looking forward to hearing from you if you use these resources in your classroom. And please feel free to share the webinar archive with a friend. Thanks so much.
Thank you.